everyone. This is and here is a fun way, new way for homebrewed classes at trying the curated reading list. And so I've taken a bunch of the questions and things y'all sent and come up with a little reading list, and I'm going to introduce the books on them, and then maybe with me saying whatever I think is alluring about it related to the topics and such. You'll know maybe a priority list or what you want to go check out and all that kind of thing. All right. So this is the book list for just like intros in general. If you are digging in to theology and you're coming to it without a large amount of academic background, like what are the books to read to give you a framework? All right. And here's a few of my favorites. Number one, Quest for the Living God, Mapping Frontiers in Theology by Elizabeth Johnson. Elizabeth Johnson is a Catholic feminist theologian, she was a longtime professor at Fordham University, won the Grawemeyer Award for her book, She Who Is, which is a beautiful feminist doctrine of God in the Catholic tradition. But she's also been invested in not just ecumenical conversations, but pluralist conversations. And in this book, she nails introducing the vibrancy of the theological conversation at present in one book. Like what she ends up doing is using this metaphor for different kind of schools of thought, from liberation theology to womanist theology, to Maharista theology. Like throughout it, you get to hear these different parts of the globe, different communities in the church. What happens when they actually get a voice in the larger theological conversation? And so she introduces them, the kind of energy and questions and problems they're trying to solve. What are their big contributions? And then what happens if we start to sit around, let's say, a metaphorical campfire and talk? Elizabeth Johnson, Quest for the Living God. It's also extremely accessible if you're jumping in. Now, here's a couple fun ones. I think that if you're more familiar, let's say, with one place that you think theologically, what your tradition or something, and you're like, so how do all these other places exist? Or what are the ways, the big questions, the ones like this class are centered on, start to reshape theology? One book I love recommending and teaching, Theological Worlds, Understanding Alternative Rhythms of Christian Belief, W. Paul Jones. And the title is really self-explanatory. Theological worlds, like part of what gets itself done in theology, a mythopoetic structure and organization of symbols and rituals, different heartbeats or threads of the tradition, all wound up to kind of have a cohesive presentation. There are different ways, different worlds, in a sense, being encapsulated or conjured in our theology. And this wants to introduce a multiplicity of them, similar to what Elizabeth Johnson does. But in it, it gives more of an anatomy of these different traditions. Like, what are the big intuitions in them? What are the big problems? How do they understand specific questions and contrast them to see how you can have these multiplicity of worlds that are internally consistent, that are driven by an agenda organic to it, the questions where it comes out of the ground, but then you get this cacophony of beautiful expressions of the Christian tradition. You'll start to attach yourself to one or the other and, be hybrid of sorts and things. But it is a beautiful text. If it's your first time digging into a theological text, it actually is quite helpful in giving just enough footnotes for you to go chase stuff, but not so much that the weird phrasing of different scholars confuses you. I love teaching it for an intro to theology class, and so it also shows how these different intuitions change over time. So Theological Worlds, W. Paul Jones, definitely worth checking out. The other intro book that I think, if you're coming out of a conservative context and you want to understand that not just that there's a multiplicity of theological homes in the present within the church, but these conversations, the different dividing lines or starting points or trajectories are built in from the beginning. This book, Christian Thought Revisited, Three Types of Theology, Justo Gonzalez. He is a famous historical theologian. He has both a multi-volume church history, the story of Christianity, I think, and then the history of Christian thought, which is, I think, 3 volumes. And they're excellent texts. And he is a Cuban historical theologian, a long time resident in Atlanta. I think taught at Columbia, which is the Presbyterian school, for a long time. And in this book, which, look at this, it's super short. I bet it's 140 pages of really large print. What it does is point out that from the very beginning of the earliest church, when they start to wrestle with big questions, there were kind of 3 centers of theological answers. And ones that you might see like in Carthage area with Tertullian, that frame the understanding of the gospel this way. These are their philosophical conversation partners. Here's then how it would understand sin and forgiveness and the human predicament and all that kind of thing. And then goes, yeah, but over here in Alexandria, the Neoplatonists are hanging out with like Origen and Clement of Alexandria and Philo and blah, blah, blah. And it plays out this way. But then over in Asia Minor, Irenaeus and company are developing. And you get these 3 types of theology just there in the early church. And they keep showing up over and over. And so often, I think people in America coming out of a conservative evangelicalism are coming out of what he calls type A, like theology. But there's always been type B and type C. You'll see that then there are people that blend them and this kind of thing. But it's not only an introduction to the history of theology, it also wants you to realize that the debates and things we're having now, there's a thread of continuity, that these are the kind of arguments you have if you're Christian. Now, one perk of this book is you'll probably realize, like, some of us that are more process types, we're like, oh, junk. I love type C, Irenaeus, that evolutionary style. He gets me hype. But also type B with Origen, I'm like, yeah, I love something. Anyway, you find like your tribe. You can then start to track where your peeps might have been through church history. You'll also see ways people connect the dots between different ones. But the other element of it is that it helps you realize that difference in theology has run all the way down throughout church history. There's never been one settled version. And the creative explosions at different points in history have been when they blended them. When they realized that this part of the church they had been ignoring actually had a solution for this over here. Anyway, it's exciting. It's an easy way where all of a sudden this diversity and multiplicity and you're like, oh, these all can't be true at the same time. Yeah. If you're trying to get one single monologic account, probably not going to happen by investigating history. But if you want to learn that the community, the history, the witness of all these saints in the past, is that the questions we carry as people of faith, trying to wrestle with the world in light of the God of love revealed in Christ, can lead us to all sorts of different conclusions. And perhaps theology plays a different function than creating boundaries. It's the horizon of faith as we move through time and context and challenges and such. Justo Gonzalez also has a little introduction to Christian theology that he wrote with his wife, who's also, well, actually, I don't think it is his wife. I have to go look. Anyway, the intro to Christian theology here is similarly sized, and it is a very historical introduction. And I find it to be what do you want to say? It's consistently at the center in the way it describes the different doctrines. It's really helpful. And yeah, anyway, next, these will just be brief. If you're like interested in the way theology gets introduced in the academy, often, especially in the UK and such, Alistair McGrath has a whole series like Theology, the Basics. There's a reader, there's a church history thing. Those might be fun if you can grab used copies, because you can hop into specific topics and check the footnotes or check how he's laying out different debates and such. Like, here's an example. I mean, he's, a rather conservative theologian and such, but like in the God chapter, because people's dominant questions today are different than before, is the father language primarily about being a father. And he pulls out how it functions in scripture, how even the Catholic catechism doesn't, by calling God Father, the language of faith indicates 2 things: that God is first the origin of everything and transcendent authority, and that God is at the same time goodness and loving care for all God's children. So like and so like while being very historically orthodox and such, he tackles the questions a lot of people have and gives the most generous giving of a very orthodox account of Christianity. Um, I it's I find it helpful to use. One, if I think, oh, Trip, oh, look at you going down the slippery slope of liberalism, then you can go like, well, what's McGrath doing over here? It's a giant series. And last, a number of you asked like intro to process books, intro to process theology. I usually tell people one of two things. One, God Christ Church by Marjorie Suhaki. It is a very practical introduction to process theology, where it spends time looking at your spiritual life, your spiritual experiences, what it means to live in response to the Spirit, and then builds out theology from life lived before God. There's Robert Mesley's Introduction to Process Theology might be better if you're just looking for a summary of the ideas and such. But Marjorie's, I think, helps you learn to think in the flow of sorts. So there you go. Those are based on the questions and things y'all sent in of where to start. Hopefully that's helpful. And feel free to ask questions, book related, book recommendation based for next week, or say, Trip, why would you record a bunch of videos with you showing books? It's not necessary. But don't post it publicly. It hurt my feelings. You could just send me a message. Anyway, thanks.